In September 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher sent a telegram from a coral island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He had found a skull. Then he found more. 13 bones in total, scattered near the remains of a campfire under a wren tree on the southeast end of an island called Gardner. Around them, the things that turn a pile of bones into a story. A woman's shoe. A box that had held a sextant, the instrument a navigator uses to find his position by the stars. And an empty bottle of Benedictine liqueur. Gallagher had been on that island less than a year, but he knew what everyone in the Pacific knew. 3 years earlier, in July 1937, the most famous woman in the world had vanished somewhere in this ocean, flying east with a navigator beside her. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan had taken off from New Guinea, aimed at a speck of coral called Howland Island, and never arrived. Gardner Island, today it is called Nikumaroro, sits 350 nautical miles southeast of Howland. Down the line, in the direction a lost aircraft would drift if it missed its target and turned. Gallagher packed the bones into a crate and shipped them to Fiji. And that is where this story should end, because a doctor in Fiji examined those bones and concluded they belonged to a stocky, middle-aged man. Case closed. The bones were filed away. Then they were lost. Except the story did not end. It has been running for 85 years, because in the decades since, that island has produced something almost unheard of in a cold case. Not one piece of evidence, but 4 separate lines of it, arriving independently from 4 different directions, decades apart. A set of bone measurements that a modern computer reads very differently than a doctor did in 1941. 120 radio distress calls that were thrown away in 1937 and reconsidered in this century. A collection of objects picked up off the ground. And an anomaly sitting in the island's lagoon that shows up on satellite imagery and on aerial photographs taken in 1938. 4 lines of evidence, all pointing at the same square kilometer of coral. And not one of them, on its own, proves anything at all. That is what makes this case worth 85 years of argument, and it is what this video is about. Not whether Amelia Earhart died on Nikumaroro. I am not going to tell you that, because nobody knows. What we are going to do is take each of the 4 lines apart, look at what it actually shows, and then look just as hard at the reason it might mean nothing. I will tell you now that one of those 4 lines has already collapsed. The single most famous physical object ever recovered from that island, the one that made headlines around the world, has been quietly withdrawn. And it was withdrawn by the man who found it. On this channel, we do these cases one way, the evidence and the limits both on the table. So let's do this one properly. Because there is a reason this is worth your time right now, in a way it has not been for 85 years. In October, a ship leaves the port of Tarawa, carrying an expedition to that lagoon. They expect to announce what they find live from the field. And by the end of this video, you will know exactly what they are looking for and exactly how much it would take to settle this. Start with the bones, because everything else on this island is argued in their shadow. Here is what Gallagher actually had in 1940. 13 bones, a partial skeleton, weathered, incomplete, with clear signs that animals had been at the site. A skull, parts of the arms and legs. Not a body, a fraction of one, scattered over a small area of ground. Gallagher was not a scientist, but he was careful. He wrote down where things lay. He noted the campfire, the bird and turtle bones around it, the remains of meals. He noted the shoe, and he thought it was a woman's. He noted the sextant box, and he recorded the numbers stenciled on it. And he did something that mattered a great deal later. He told his superiors he thought this might be Amelia Earhart, and he asked what to do. What he was told essentially was, keep it quiet and send the bones to Fiji. In Fiji, they were examined by a doctor named David Hoodless, the principal of the Central Medical School. In 1941, Hoodless measured them by hand, wrote up his findings, and concluded that the remains belonged to a male, stocky, middle-aged, of European or mixed European descent, roughly 5'5". That verdict did what verdicts do. It ended the inquiry. Nobody was looking for a stocky, middle-aged man in 1941. The bones went into storage in Fiji, and at some point in the following decades, they disappeared. Nobody knows where they are. They have not been seen in over 70 years. So we cannot test them. There is no DNA to extract, no re-examination possible, no second opinion on the actual material. Everything that follows is an argument about a document. Because Hoodless left behind 7 measurements. 7 numbers describing the skull and the long bones. In 1998, and then in far more detail in 2018, a forensic anthropologist named Richard Jantz of the University of Tennessee went back to those 7 numbers. Jantz is not a fringe figure. He is one of the people who built the standard tools of his field, and he ran Hoodless's measurements through 4DISC, the software that most board-certified forensic anthropologists in the United States use to estimate sex, ancestry, and stature from skeletal dimensions. 4DISC did not see a stocky, middle-aged man. It saw a tall woman of Northern European ancestry. And Jantz went further. He compared the 7 measurements against Amelia Earhart's own body proportions, reconstructed from her pilot's license records, from her clothing, from photographs where a known object gives scale. His published conclusion was that the Nikumaroro bones were more similar to Earhart than to 99% of individuals in a large modern reference sample. 99%. That is a striking number, and it is the number that put this island back on the map. Now here is the part that most retellings skip. Jantz did not prove that Hoodless was wrong about the bones. He proved that Hoodless's own numbers, read with modern methods, describe someone very like Amelia Earhart. Those are different claims, and the distance between them is the whole problem. Because we are not analyzing a skeleton. We are analyzing a 1941 measurement of a skeleton taken by one man with the standards and instruments of his time, and we cannot check his work. If Hoodless mismeasured and hand measurement of weathered bone is genuinely difficult, then 4DISC is faithfully processing an error. Garbage in, elegant statistics out. This is not a hypothetical objection. It has been argued in the literature, formally. A paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science set out the case that first-hand examination by a trained physician should not be overturned by what it called evaluation by proxy, statistical reanalysis of numbers by people who never saw the material. And there is a second problem, quieter but just as real. Nikumaroro is not a place where finding human remains is astonishing. Pacific Islands have castaways. They have shipwreck victims. A ship called the Norwich City ran aground on that reef in 1929, 8 years before Earhart vanished, and 11 men died. The island was later settled, and people who settle islands also die on them. So the honest summary of Case 1 is this. A set of bones found in the right place with objects that fit, a woman's shoe, a navigator's sextant box. Measured once by a man who is not here to defend his work, and then lost. reanalyzed 80 years later by a leading expert who found a signal that is hard to dismiss and impossible to confirm. It is the strongest circumstantial evidence in the entire case, and it cannot be tested. Not now, not ever, unless someone opens a forgotten cupboard in Fiji. Which brings us to the obvious question. If they came down on that island, they were not silent. They had a radio. And for 6 days in July 1937, half the Pacific was listening. In the week after Amelia Earhart disappeared, something happened that has almost dropped out of the popular story. People started hearing her. Not one person, not a handful. Between the 2nd and the 18th of July 1937, roughly 120 separate reports came in of radio signals believed to be from the missing aircraft. Some were from professional operators at Pan American stations, some were from Navy and Coast Guard receivers, and a number came from ordinary people at home sitting in front of shortwave sets. This was not a footnote to the search, it was the search. Those signals drove the operational decisions of the United States Navy and Coast Guard for days. Ships changed course because of them. The largest search in American naval history to that date was steered in part by voices in the static. And then the search failed. Nothing was found. And in the aftermath, the entire body of post-loss radio reports was categorically dismissed. All of it. Hoaxes, misidentifications, wishful thinking, harmonics from other stations. The file was closed on the whole category. For 60 years, that was the settled view. Then people went back and did the arithmetic. The reanalysis is the most technical part of this case, and it is also the most interesting, so stay with me. The question is not, did someone hear something? Of course people heard things. The shortwave bands in 1937 were crowded and strange. The question is whether any of the reports have properties that a hoaxer or a mistaken listener could not have produced. 3 things were tested. The first is frequency. Earhart's aircraft transmitted on specific frequencies, 3,105 kHz and 6,210 kHz, with 500 kHz available as well. A member of the public in 1937 did not generally know those numbers. Reports that specify the right frequency from people with no way of knowing it are a different class of evidence from reports that simply say, "I heard a woman's voice." The second is propagation. Radio at those frequencies does not travel in a straight line to wherever you like. It bounces, and where it lands depends on the time of day, the season, the position of the sun. You can model it, and you can ask for each report. At that hour, on that date, at that frequency, could a signal from the Central Pacific physically have reached the place where this person says they heard it? Some reports fail that test outright. Others pass. When those filters were applied to all 120 reports, 57 of them survived as credible. 57. Out of a body of evidence that had been thrown away in its entirety. And then there is the third test, which is the one that I find genuinely difficult to argue away. If the Electra was down on Nikumaroro, it was not floating in a lagoon. It would have been sitting on the reef flat, a shelf of hard coral that extends out from the shore and is exposed at low tide and submerged at high. And here is the mechanical constraint. To transmit, Earhart needed to run the right engine because the radio drew power from the aircraft's generator. To run the engine, the aircraft had to be out of the water, which means transmissions were only possible at low tide. So somebody built the tide tables. The actual water levels on that reef, hour by hour, for the 2nd through the 9th of July, 1937, and then laid the credible signals over them. They cluster in the low water windows. Think about what that means. In 1937, the people reporting these signals had no tide data for an uninhabited island they had never heard of. Nobody in the chain, not the listeners, not the newspapers, not the Navy, was thinking about the reef at Gardner Island at all. For the timing to line up by chance across dozens of independent reports is a coincidence of a fairly demanding kind. That is the case for the radio. Now the case against it. The word doing the heavy lifting in all of this is credible. 57 signals were judged credible. But judged by whom? Against criteria set by whom? The analysis was carried out by an organization that has spent 30 years advancing the Nikumaroro hypothesis. That does not make the work wrong. Careful people can be right about things they want to be true. But when the same group defines the filter and then reports how much survives it, you are entitled to want that filter checked by someone with no stake in the answer. And there is a second issue. Roughly half the reports were discarded as not credible. Fine, but 120 reports about a single event, most of them wrong, tells you something about the environment. This was a global news story. People wanted to hear her. In that atmosphere, some correct-sounding details will occur by chance, and the ones that fit get remembered, while the ones that do not fit get filed as noise. Then there is Betty. In the summer of 1937, a 15-year-old girl in Florida named Betty Klenk sat at her father's shortwave set and wrote down, over about an hour and 3/4, what she believed was a woman calling for help. She filled several pages of a notebook. A frightened woman, a man who was hurt and not making sense, water coming in. Betty kept that notebook for 63 years. It surfaced in 2000. I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of artifact that a story like this can lean on too hard. A teenager's notebook is not a laboratory instrument. It was produced with no chain of custody, and it emerged into a world that already had a theory waiting for it. What can be said is narrower, and it is still interesting. The notebook contains details that are difficult to explain as invention by a teenager in 1937, and the timing of the entries is consistent with the low tide window on the reef. So, Case 2. A body of evidence that was thrown out wholesale, brought back decades later, and found to contain a core that survives frequency, propagation, and tide analysis. Suggestive. Genuinely suggestive, and built entirely out of testimony and modeling without a single physical object, which is exactly what the next line of evidence was supposed to provide. Testimony can be doubted. Statistics can be contested. A piece of metal is a piece of metal. Between 1989 and 2019, teams went to Nikumaroro again and again, more than a dozen expeditions, and they came back with objects. Small things mostly, fragments picked up off the ground on a coral island that is a kilometer wide at its broadest and has been thoroughly rearranged by storms for 90 years. Some of those objects are genuinely arresting. There is a jar. It was recovered in 5 pieces and reassembled into a nearly complete small ointment pot of a style matching Dr. C.H. Berry's freckle ointment, a product sold in the early 20th century to fade freckles. Amelia Earhart had freckles, and by every account she disliked them. That is the kind of detail that sits in your mind and refuses to leave. There are fragments of plexiglass, of a thickness and curvature consistent with aircraft window material. There are pieces of shoe, and there is a photograph. In October 1937, 3 months after the disappearance, A British colonial officer named Eric Bevington visited Gardner Island and took pictures. In one of them, at the water's edge, there is a small object protruding from the surface. Enlarge it, and it is a shape, something with structure sticking out of the water where nothing should be. The claim is that it is a landing gear assembly from a Lockheed Electra, photographed while the aircraft was still on the reef before the sea took it. And then there is the aluminium. In 1991, a team recovered a sheet of aircraft-grade aluminium from the island. Artifact 22V1, riveted, torn, weathered. For the next 30 years, it was the centerpiece of the entire Nikumaroro case, and the argument built around it was elegant. Amelia Earhart's Electra had a window on the rear right side. At some point during the world flight, it was removed and replaced with a plain aluminium patch, an unrecorded field repair. There is exactly one clear photograph of that patch, taken on the tarmac in Miami on the morning she left. It appears in no engineering drawing and no maintenance log. It is a fingerprint, a modification unique to that one aircraft. The claim was that 22V1 was that patch. In 2014, that claim went around the world. It was, briefly, the closest anyone had come to physical proof. And it is wrong. Not disputed, not controversial. The people who argued against it were making narrow, checkable, physical points, and they were making them for years. The thickness of the metal does not match. The spacing of the rivet holes does not match the pattern on the aircraft. The alloy and its markings do not match what Lockheed used in that position. The dimensions do not fit the opening it was said to cover. You cannot argue with rivet spacing. Either the holes line up or they do not. And eventually the man who found it, Rick Gillespie, the person with the most to lose from this conclusion, the person who had defended that artifact publicly for 3 decades, conceded the point. He acknowledged that the most logical source for the metal is a different aircraft entirely, a C-47 transport that crashed and burned on Sydney Island in the same island group in 1943. Local people salvaged the wreckage, and some families from Sydney Island were later resettled on Nikumaroro. They brought scrap metal with them because on a coral island in the Pacific, sheet aluminium is a valuable material. You make things out of it. That is the end of the strongest physical evidence in this case, withdrawn on the evidence by its own author. I want to stop here for a second because how you feel about that paragraph determines whether you are watching the right channel. You could read it as a scandal, 30 years of hype collapsing. I read it as the single most reassuring thing in this entire story. A man spent 3 decades arguing for a piece of metal, and when the physical measurements would not support him, he said so. That is not the system failing. That is the system working, slowly and publicly, and at real personal cost. If that is the kind of distinction you want kept straight, subscribe. There is one more line of evidence, and it is the one that is about to be tested for real. Because once you accept that the aluminium is gone, the same acid has to be poured over everything else on the list. The island was inhabited. From 1938 to 1963, Nikumaroro was a settlement, a colonial resettlement scheme, with families, a village, a cooperative store. People lived there for a quarter of a century. They brought possessions, they brought scrap, they left rubbish, and the rubbish weathered into the ground. So, a small ointment jar of an early 20th century American brand, found on an island where a British colonial administration and dozens of Pacific Island families lived for 25 years. Is that Amelia Earhart's? Or is it what it looks like on any inhabited site? Somebody's old jar. Plexiglass fragments of a thickness consistent with aircraft glazing, on an island in a group where at least one military aircraft is known to have crashed and burned, in a theatre of the Second World War that scattered aluminium and perspex across the entire Pacific. Pieces of shoe on an island where people wore shoes for 25 years. And the Bevington object, a few dozen pixels on a 70-year-old photograph, enlarged past the point where the emulsion carries real information. It might be landing gear. It might equally be a piece of the wreck of the Norwich City, which had been sitting on that same reef since 1929 and is unambiguously in other photographs of the same shoreline. None of this proves nothing happened there. It proves something harder to sit with, that an inhabited island cannot easily produce a decisive artifact, because everything you find has an ordinary explanation available. To break through that, you would need an object that could only have come from one aircraft. A serial number, an engine block, a data plate. Nobody has found one, not in 30 years of looking on land. Which is why everything now depends on the water. In 2020, someone examining satellite imagery of Nikumaroro noticed a shape in the lagoon. It is in shallow water near the eastern end, in an area called Tarawa. It has straight edges where the lagoon floor has none. It is roughly the size and proportion of a small aircraft, and it does not move between images. That last point is the one that matters, and it is what lifted this above the ordinary run of satellite anomalies. Because when they went looking backwards through the historical record, the shape appears in aerial photographs of the lagoon taken in 1938. 1938. 1 year after the disappearance. Before the settlement was established. Before the Second World War put aircraft into this ocean by the thousand. If the object in those 1938 photographs is the object on the 2020 satellite images, then there has been something aircraft-shaped lying in that lagoon since the year after Amelia Earhart went missing, and nobody has ever put a hand on it. That is the Tarawa object. That is what the October expedition is going to touch. Now, the counter-argument, and I am going to give it as much room as it deserves, because it comes from someone who went there. Evan Gillespie, no relation to the Tiger founder, a researcher and writer who has visited the site, looked at the same imagery and reached a mundane conclusion. He says it is a tree. Specifically, a pandanus tree, a large, structurally distinctive tree that grows on Pacific atolls, and after storms regularly washes into the lagoon and comes to rest on the bottom. On later satellite passes, he argues, it is very clearly a tree with what reads as a trunk and a crown once you know what you are looking at. A pandanus washed into a lagoon is not an exotic hypothesis. It is the single most likely thing to be lying on the bottom of a Pacific atoll lagoon that is not sand. And notably, Gillespie is not a debunker of the wider case. He allows that Nikumaroro could still be where Earhart ended up. He simply does not think this particular shape is her aircraft. So we have an object that has apparently been in place since 1938, which is either the most important find in the history of this mystery or a fallen tree. There is no way to settle that from orbit, which is the entire reason for what happens next. An expedition led by the Archaeological Legacy Institute with Purdue University and the Purdue Research Foundation has spent years getting permission to go and put instruments on that object. The Republic of Kiribati approved it by cabinet vote, and the news was announced on the 24th of July, Amelia Earhart's birthday. The team leaves the United States and Canada on the 3rd of October. They sail from Tarawa on the 7th, aboard a chartered vessel of the Kiribati National Shipping Line with a government representative aboard. And they expect to make a public announcement identifying the Tarawa object live from the field on or about the 16th of October. Purdue's involvement is not incidental, by the way. Amelia Earhart worked at Purdue. The Purdue Research Foundation funded the Electra. The aircraft she disappeared in was bought with their money. If it is found, there is an institution with a legal and historical claim to it, and a plan for what happens next. And they are not the only ones in the water. A separate ocean exploration effort is preparing to search the deep sea floor near Howland Island, on the older and frankly more probable theory that the aircraft ran out of fuel where it was supposed to be, went into the ocean, and sank in water thousands of meters deep. They say new analysis has sharply narrowed their search box. 2 teams, 2 incompatible theories, both looking this year. One of them is looking in a lagoon you could stand up in. So where does that leave us after 85 years? With 4 lines of evidence and an honest account of each, the bones are the strongest thing here, and they cannot be tested because they are gone. What survives is 7 numbers and a serious modern analysis that reads those numbers as a tall Northern European woman, with the permanent caveat that we are analyzing a measurement, not a body. The radio signals are stranger and better than their reputation. 57 reports survive frequency and propagation filtering, and they cluster in the windows when the tide would have let her run an engine. That is a hard coincidence to manufacture in 1937. It is also, in the end, testimony. The objects on the ground have not delivered. The best of them was withdrawn by the man who found it, and everything else has an ordinary explanation available on an island where people lived for 25 years. And the thing in the lagoon is either an aircraft that has been sitting there since 1938 or a tree. Notice what none of that adds up to. It does not add up to proof, and it does not add up to a hoax. It adds up to something much more common in real investigations and much rarer in stories about them. A case that is genuinely unresolved, where the honest position is to hold several possibilities open at once and wait for a measurement. The measurement is coming. In October, a ship reaches that lagoon, and somebody puts their hands on that object, and one of 2 things becomes true. Either 85 years of argument end in an afternoon, or the most promising lead in the case turns out to be a fallen tree, and the search moves to the deep water off Howland, where the simplest theory has been waiting the whole time. I do not know which. Nobody does. That is the point. What I can tell you is that we will cover the result the moment it comes in, either way, including if the answer is boring. Subscribe if you want that version of it, rather than the one that is already written before the ship sails. Tell me in the comments which of the 4 lines you find hardest to dismiss. For me, it is the tides. I keep coming back to the fact that the signals arrive when the reef is dry. And if these 35 minutes were worth it, leave a like. It is the clearest signal that careful versions of these stories are worth making. Until October.